For nearly 4 decades, one man ran the entire New England underworld from a vending machine shop on a narrow street in Providence, Rhode Island. No headlines carried his name. No cameras followed him. He simply sat in a back room on Federal Hill, and the loan sharks, the bookmakers, the judges, and the politicians came to him. This was the quiet capital of the American underworld, a city that ran on two economies at once, one visible and one hidden, and for a very long time the hidden one won. Then, on the same street as his office, federal agents began to listen. What they recorded would take them decades to use. But in the end, those tapes would unmake not one empire in Providence, but two. To understand how a city becomes a place like that, you have to understand what it was losing. Providence did not begin in shadow. At the turn of the 20th century, it was one of the great manufacturing cities of America, a place of textile mills and machine shops and jewelry factories so dense and so productive that Rhode Island was known, without much exaggeration, as the jewelry capital of the world. 3 out of every 5 working people in the state earned their living making things with their hands. The mills ran along the rivers. The immigrant neighborhoods filled with Irish and Portuguese and Italian families who had come to build a life on that labor. And then, slowly, over the span of a single lifetime, all of it began to leave. The textile industry drifted south in search of cheaper work. The Great Depression hollowed out what remained. By the time the middle of the century arrived, the state had already lived through decades of quiet economic decline, and the mills that had defined Providence stood emptier each year. The jewelry trade held on longer than the rest, and then it, too, gave way to cheaper factories across the ocean. By the end of the century, barely 1 in 6 workers still made anything at all. This is the part of the story that gets forgotten. Before Providence was a city ruled by the mob, it was a city with a hole in the middle of it, a place where the honest economy was retreating faster than anyone wanted to admit. And into that kind of vacuum, something always moves. What moved into Providence was a man named Raymond Patriarca. By the mid-1950s, Patriarcha had consolidated control over the loose network of Italian-American crime in New England, and he made a decision that would define the region for the next 30 years. He moved the seat of that power out of Boston and into Providence. He set up his headquarters behind a modest storefront at 168 Atwells Avenue, in the heart of the Italian neighborhood on Federal Hill. On paper, it was a vending machine and pinball company, the National Cigarette Service and Coin-O-Matic distributors. In truth, it was the nerve center of organized crime for 6 states, and everyone in the neighborhood knew it. They called it simply the office. Patriarcha was not a flashy man. He did not want to be seen. He lived quietly in the same neighborhood he had always known, and every day he commuted to that small office and held court in the back room. Men who knew him described someone who almost never raised his voice, who ran a criminal empire the way a careful executive runs a company, patient, deliberate, and cold. Some called him the Quiet Don. He preferred to be a rumor rather than a name. But the quiet was a kind of armor. On warm days, it was said, he would stand outside the shop with a cigar, watching the street for anyone who did not belong. He did not have to watch alone. Along Atwells Avenue, the vendors and the residents functioned as his eyes, spotters who noticed every unfamiliar car and every stranger asking questions. Federal Hill was an open-air market and an armed camp at the same time. To walk down, it was to be watched by 100 people who owed their loyalty, one way or another, to the man in the back room. If you find yourself drawn to the way American cities quietly bury their own histories, take a moment to subscribe before we go further. Stay with this one, because the empire on Atwells Avenue was only the first of 2. What made Patriarcha extraordinary was not violence, though there was plenty of it. It was reach. Almost nothing happened in the New England underworld without his knowledge and his approval. The gambling, the loan sharking, the bookmaking, the protection rackets that stretched from Providence up through Boston and out across Connecticut, all of it eventually flowed back to that one desk. Every illegal card game, every after-hours operation paid something upward. The enterprise generated millions of dollars a year in an era when $1 million was a fortune, and the money was only part of the power. The rest of the power was invisible, and it was worse. When federal investigators finally reconstructed what had been said inside the office, they found something that should trouble anyone who believes a city belongs to its citizens. Patriarcha's reach did not stop at the edge of the underworld. It ran directly into the machinery of government. There were conversations about payments reaching the governor's office, about state legislators, about judges. In some accounts, judges were said to seek his blessing before they ruled. The line between the criminal and the official, the thing we assume protects us, had simply dissolved. Providence was not a city with a mafia problem. For a generation, it was a city with two governments, and the one on Federal Hill answered to no election. That was the empire. Now here is how the light first reached it. In the early 1960s, the federal government finally decided that organized crime was a national threat worth fighting, and the campaign against it began in New England at a single address. In March of 1962, agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation secretly entered 168 Atwells Avenue and planted a listening device inside the office. For more than 3 years, until the summer of 1965, that hidden microphone recorded the daily business of the most secretive criminal in America. The agents wrote down everything. They filled more than 7,000 pages with summaries of what they heard. And here is the tragedy hidden inside that triumph. The bug had been placed illegally by trespass, with no warrant of any kind. It violated the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution, the very promise that a person's private space cannot be invaded without cause, which meant that the most complete portrait ever assembled of an American crime boss, thousands of pages describing his empire in his own words, could not be used to convict him. The government had heard everything and could prove almost nothing. The original tapes were eventually erased. What survived were only the agent's notes, and for years those notes stayed locked away. A secret history of the city that the city was not allowed to read. The empire was not broken by the recording. It was broken, at least for a time, the older way. In the middle of the 1960s, a hitman named Joe Barboza, facing his own imprisonment, decided to talk. His testimony did what the tapes could not. In 1968, Patriarcha was sentenced to prison for conspiring in the murder of a rival gambler who had been shot to death in a phone booth. 2 years later, in 1970, he was convicted again in a conspiracy to kill 2 more men gunned down inside a Providence grocery store. And yet, even from a cell, he did not truly lose his grip. He continued to run the family from prison. The office endured. The quiet Don had been caught, but the machine he built kept turning, because a machine like that is never really one man. It would take another 20 years and a second recording to finish what the first one started. In July of 1984, Raymond Patriarca died of heart failure. An old man at last, in the city he had ruled from the shadows for most of his life. His death was not the end of the empire. It was the beginning of its long unraveling. Power passed to his son, Raymond Patriarca Jr., a man who did not have his father's gift for control. The family that had been held together by one careful hand began to fracture between its Providence and Boston factions, and into that weakness, the federal government moved again. On a night in the autumn of 1989, inside a house at 34 Guild Street in Medford, Massachusetts, the New England Mafia gathered to do the most secret thing it ever did. They inducted new members. They performed a ceremony that outsiders had heard about for decades but had never witnessed. A ritual of blood oaths and burning holy cards and whispered vows of eternal silence. What the men in that room did not know was that one of their own had betrayed them. and that the Bureau had run a wire into the house the night before. For the first time in the history of the United States, federal agents recorded a mafia induction ceremony as it happened. The secret that the whole enterprise was built to protect was now sitting on a reel of tape. The recordings became the foundation of a prosecution described at the time as the most sweeping attack ever launched on a single organized crime family. In March of 1990, 21 reputed members were indicted. In the trials that followed, the leadership of the family was convicted under the racketeering laws and sent away for years. The new underboss who replaced Patriarcha's son was sentenced to more than a decade and died behind bars. By 1992, the men who had run the New England underworld were, one after another, gone. The empire that Raymond Patriarca had built from a vending machine shop, the empire the government had listened to for 30 years but could never quite touch, was finally, quietly, over. You would think that would be the end of Providence's story of hidden power. It was only the intermission, because the culture that let a city run on secrets did not die with the mob. It had simply learned to wear a suit and stand behind a podium. And its second chapter was the story of a mayor named Vincent Cianci, whom everyone in Providence called Buddy. Cianci had once been an organized crime prosecutor. He was first elected mayor in 1974, running as a reformer, the anti-corruption candidate, the man who would clean up City Hall. For a while, he was something Providence had not had in a long time, a figure of genuine hope. He resigned in disgrace in the middle of the 1980s after a violent personal scandal, and then, astonishingly, he came back, winning the office again and taking power in 1991 for a second long reign. This was the era that Providence still remembers with real affection. The years of the so-called Renaissance, when the rivers downtown were uncovered and lit with fire on summer nights, when a new mall and a new hockey team and a restored downtown made the old industrial city feel, briefly, alive again. But underneath the lights, the oldest machine in Providence was still running. City Hall, it turned out, was for sale. Contracts, tax breaks, city jobs, the small permissions that a government controls, all of it had a price, and the price flowed upward the same way it always had on Federal Hill. This time, the man in the back room was the mayor himself. The investigation that exposed it had nothing to do with the mafia. It was a separate federal operation, born years later and aimed directly at the government of the city. The agents gave it a fitting name. They called it Operation Plunder Dome. It began quietly in the late 1990s, following a trail of suspicious leases and bribes, and on the morning of the 28th of April, 1999, it burst into the open when federal agents walked into Providence City Hall and began carrying out crates of documents. Over the next years, the investigation climbed, office by office, until it reached the top. In 2001, Buddy Cianci was indicted. In the summer of 2002, a jury convicted him of racketeering conspiracy, the same kind of charge once written to bring down mafia bosses, now used against the elected leader of a city. He was acquitted of most of the individual counts, but the central verdict held. He went to federal prison for more than 4 years. The city had been run from the shadows twice. First by a man who never wanted to be seen, then by a man who wanted to be seen more than anything in the world. And both times, it was patient federal surveillance, the quiet work of listening and recording, that finally brought the hidden thing into the light. But a city does not escape a century like that without paying for it. And Providence's bill came due slowly. The corruption was only the visible symptom of something deeper. For generations, a city run on favors and patronage had made promises it could not keep to workers, to retirees, to itself. It had deferred its costs the way it had deferred its reckonings. And when the reckoning finally arrived, it did not come as a scandal. It came as arithmetic. By the time a new mayor, Angel Taveras, took office in 2011, he inherited a deficit of roughly $110 million and a pension fund so starved of money that it held only about a third of what it owed the people counting on it. He described it, memorably, as a Category 5 fiscal hurricane. Just up the road, the small Rhode Island city of Central Falls had already collapsed into bankruptcy. Providence stood on the same edge. Saving it required closing schools, cutting workers, raising taxes, and asking the city's own retirees to give up money they had been promised. The capital of Rhode Island avoided bankruptcy by the narrowest of margins, not through any single villain, but under the accumulated weight of decades of a city living beyond the truth. That is the real cost of a place that runs on secrets. It is not only the crimes, it is the long erosion of the ordinary trust that lets a city govern itself honestly. The slow bill that arrives long after the men who ran up the tab are gone. Walk down Atwells Avenue today and you would never know. The narrow street on Federal Hill is now one of the most beloved restaurant rows in New England, hung with lights, crowded with visitors who have no idea that the quiet man who once controlled 6 states used to stand on that same sidewalk with a cigar, watching for anyone who did not belong. The old mills along the rivers have become apartments and studios. The jewelry factories are lofts now. On top of the marble State House, a gilded figure the city calls the Independent Man still stands against the sky, holding his spear exactly as he has for more than a century. He is a fitting symbol for Providence, though perhaps not in the way the sculptor intended. For most of the last century, the city beneath him was not independent at all. It was governed again and again by men whose names never appeared on any ballot, or whose names appeared on every ballot and hid the truth all the same. The investigation that undid them did not arrive as a single dramatic raid. It arrived as patience, as years of listening, as the slow, unglamorous faith that if you record the truth long enough, one day you will finally be able to say it out loud. Providence survived all of it. The mills, the mob, the mayors, the near collapse. It is still here, still the capital, still trying to be the honest city it was always supposed to be. That, in the end, may be the quiet triumph buried inside all this loss. A city can be run from the shadows for 100 years, but the shadows do not last forever. Someone eventually turns on the light. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the buried stories of how American cities really became what they are, subscribe and stay with us. There are more of these than you would ever guess, and most of them are still waiting in the dark.